أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره. Let's talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine from a Quranic or from a perspective of morality and religion. Now there are some things that we need to maybe clarify in our own minds. First of all, does religion or does the Quran even have a place here? Do we even need to discuss this from the perspective of the Quran? Well, I think the fact of the matter is that Islam, Quran, morality, all these things are deeply involved in this issue. Look at this video, for example. Okay, let me stop there. So, clearly what we see there is a overlapping of religion and of the war between Russia and Ukraine. In particular, what we've just seen there is the Kadyrov forces, and I'm not going to give a comment on them, who the Kadyrov forces are and, their standing, and suffice it to say that what you heard there was religious invocations, the Kalima, Allahu Akbar, famous sayings and words and ideas that come from our religion. And so the question now is, how do we think about this, and the question, I guess, also that has come up is, what legitimacy is there in Russia to have invaded Ukraine? Now, I think for the benefit of our group, for our close friends, family, etc., let me share with you my thinking, and I'm always open to being convinced or persuaded either way. But remember, my thinking is not applied based on the merits or the data that is provided to me by the enemy. When I do make a decision and when I do take a position, I gather data from all sources. The enemy is in possession of some data, but so is history. There is data located in very distant history. There is data in the Quran, and that is one of our most important sources of data. Then there is data in the current conflict, and so it's a very complex matter. You have to look at the data that is available, the data that is unavailable, the data that is legitimate in the eyes of the enemy, the data that is illegitimate in the eyes of the enemy. But we have our own sources of data. We have our own epistemology. And our epistemology includes the greater morality that is presented or projected in the Holy Book, in the Holy Quran. And so when I look at this conflict, I look at the history firstly. Now, the history of this conflict, there is a history to it, and we don't have to go too far back. For example, let's just go back to the year 2014, when there was a legitimate president, there was an elected government, there was a legal, legitimate system in place in the country called Ukraine. The country was functioning. It was not also a 100% free of injustice, free of corruption and whatever. But there was a functioning government, pretty much like in South Africa, where we have a load of injustice and a load of inequality, in fact, all over the place. But you have a legitimate government in place. So do we have the right to overthrow this government, or to call 50,000 people together in Cape Town or in Pretoria and overthrow the government when this country has 60 million people? Well, that's what happened in Ukraine in 2014, is that about 50,000 people gathered in the center of town in what they call the Maidan and decided to overthrow the elected government. And the unfortunate thing is that these people were not acting on their own volition. These people were aided by a foreign power. And if you now go back and you read the comments of Victoria Newland, who was the one of the American agents involved in that so-called Maidan revolution, then they were instrumental in overthrowing that government. So the government of 2014 in Ukraine was illegitimately overthrown. Did the country agree to the new incoming government, who saw themselves as coming to power by revolution? Did the whole country of Ukraine agree to that seizure of power? No, especially the eastern part of the country. The eastern part of the country is mostly Russian speaking, and that part of the country was unhappy with the seizure of power by the Maidan plotters. And the Maidan plotters just simply turned these people into into pariahs. They turned the people in eastern Ukraine into an enemy and declared war on these people. And those so-called republics or provinces on the eastern part of Ukraine was declared war on, and became the victims of whatever artillery and all sorts of attacks. A lot of people died. Official records say that since 2014, eastern Ukraine lost about 3,000 to 4,000 innocent people due to the bombing from the western side of Ukraine. So from the Kiev side, where the plotting and the coup took place in 2014. So first of all, let's look at the justice of this whole matter here, is that Russian-speaking Ukraine was turned on by the western part of Ukraine under the influence or the direction of America as an outside power. So does that count as an internal matter, or is it now a matter that has developed because of external intervention? And we know for a fact that America became the guiding hand within Ukraine since 2014. So the first premise is that Ukraine, the current government, Zelensky, who is a product of that Maidan so-called revolution, his legitimacy is only guaranteed or assured by the people that put him there, by America, the most powerful country in the world, and also the most violent and interventionist country in the world, and also the country with a record of the most human rights violations in terms of killing Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima. So in other words, more than 20 hospitals destroyed, an entire city flattened, and they've never apologized for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the king of immorality, that's why I call America, in the words of Imam Khomeini, the greatest Satan on earth today. So the greatest Satan has engineered the Maidan coup and has created a new government and a new order in Ukraine, in which Eastern Ukraine had to pay a severe price in terms of civilian deaths, destruction of their villages and their towns, etc. So now the injustice of this is a factor in this discussion. The injustice of the Maidan coup, and I haven't even mentioned the snipers, the Maidan snipers, because that has also been revealed to have been instrumental in this coup, the massacring of people by snipers. So let us move on and look at, the Quranic morality, because we have to. We are people who are based in Quran, and I want to show you a few verses here, because often we are a people of the law. We are a people who respect our agreements. We are a people who, when we make an oath or give an agreement, then we respect it. It's in fact a very core part of the instructions of the Holy Book, is that Awfu bil uqud, respect your agreements. And so when somebody shows an agreement and says that, this is an agreement that Russia was party to, then even that needs to be viewed in context. Yes, there is the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of or the War Crimes Court, or the Criminal Court, and whatever. The question with these treaties is that, we know that the law is one thing, and then we also know that the application of the law is also related to the law itself. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm 58 years old, and I've dealt with the law. I've been arrested. I have faced magistrates. I have had to create arguments in court for myself more than 5 times, even more than that. Under criminal courts, under the court of the apartheid regime, under the present court system, where I had to defend myself. And even now, right now, I've always got legal matters on my desk. And so I'm not a lawyer, but I can think for myself when it comes to the law. And from a Quranic perspective, and from even a common law perspective, if the law is not applied in an even-handed way, it reduces the validity or the legitimacy of that law. So if, for example, I am in a workplace and the law is no drinking on the job for any employee, and yet I come to work and I have a bottle of scotch in my cabinet next to my desk, and I drink every now and then. When the stress gets too much, I take it out and I have a drink. And yet when my employee is found to be drunk on the job, then it's a criminal charge and he gets sanctioned in whatever way possible. Then the question must be asked, is the law, when you condone the law in case A, why have you not condoned it in case B, in the case of the employee? And so if you cannot explain your condonement of the law in case B, then you have in fact eroded the law. You have eroded the legitimacy of the law, because the law is the law when we both respect the law. That is the point of law. Law is not there as a weapon for me or as a weapon for you. Law is there to regulate our commutual behavior, the behavior of both of us. And if it is not regulating your behavior, then why is it still regulating my behavior in regard to you? And so the Quran actually very eloquently addresses this point. And I'm not going to make this a long video, but let me show you this particular verse, where it is stated, If they violate their oaths after their covenant and taunt you for your faith, fight you, the chiefs of unfaith, for their oaths are nothing to them, that thus they may be restrained. Pay attention here. We're talking oaths here in Eima Nahum. This is similar to an oath. It is an undertaking. It is an agreement. Do you see the point? I don't have to give much explanation for that verse there. It basically, the law becomes nullified when parties to the law, or one party to the law, starts flaunting the law. Look at this also. Will you not fight people, by the way, this is the translation of Yusuf Ali. Will you not fight people who violated their oaths, plotted to expel the messenger, and took the aggressive by being the first to assault you? Do you fear them? Nay, it is Allah whom you should fear, more justly fear, if you believe. Let's look at another one here. But the treaties are not dissolved with those pagans with whom you have entered into alliance, and who have not subsequently failed you in aught, nor aided anyone against you. So fulfill your engagements with them to the end of their term, for Allah loveth the righteous. Let's pay attention to this one. You know what it says here is that treaties can be dissolved with pagans, and in this case, is there any question that the West is the pagan force here? By the West, let me be very specific here, because I don't want to blame or to get the wrong idea on the wrong people. You know, the West consists of a big number of people, about, say, plus minus 10 to 20 countries out of the world's 200 nations. There's about 20 countries in the world that have a common history, that share more or less a very common history, that share more or less a common culture and set of values, and that more or less share a common ideal for the planet and for mankind as a whole. And those people, numbering perhaps maybe not yet 1 billion, maybe 800 million or 700 million people out of the planet's population, they stick together, but they don't stick together naturally. They are knitted together by their leadership, and their leadership, or their guides are their mass media, their political leaders, their university institutions. In other words, some of their main scholars and thinkers, and the cultural icons, in popular culture. So these people, these Westerners, some call them Westernites, because they believe in the supremacy of the West. And the West, if you look physically at who is the West, then the West, those countries that I've been referring to, are primarily in today's world America, the United States of America, the country to the north of them, Canada. Then moving to Europe, there are 4 or 5 main countries: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and a few countries in Scandinavia. And then if you move to the other side of the globe, then it includes Australia and New Zealand. But there are also prominent minorities included in that West, so-called West, that we refer to. Like, for example, in South Africa. In South Africa, there's a population of about 3 to 4 million Westerners, hardcore Westerners. And the common thing about this people that we call the Westerners or the Westernites is that they are primarily the leadership, the guiding thinking, the goals, the ideals, historically emanate from white colonialism, European colonialism, and from the Enlightenment. And their present-day thinking are also guided by Judeo-Christian white values and ideas. And so to say that the West or Westernism is primarily a white man's thing would not be an unreasonable point to make, although there are many key Indian faces or brown faces or, different color faces playing their role there, like Barack Obama was president of America. We know that the power structure, the deep state, the forces behind the players are in fact deeply entrenched people who are immersed in the culture of Europeanism, Westernism, who are white people. Barack Obama's entire cabinet was white. His advisors were white. The people who got him elected were white. So Barack Obama is not really a black man running the show. It's a black man, being the front man. That's all. So what we know is that the value system of the West, the value system of America, is based on a secular, non-religious value system. So in fact, one of the cornerstones of Western thinking is the rejection of the God hypothesis, isn't it? I mean, who will disagree with me that if God is central to Western philosophy or Western ideas or Western ideals, then you would see it. But wherever the West goes, it banishes God from the schools and from wherever, from the public sphere. So in fact, what we can say from a Quranic perspective is that the West is pagan. The West is in fact a pagan force on earth. And we see it in their practices today. The fact that they are insisting that 7-year-old children must have the right to choose their gender, and that they want to take that right away from parents. The fact that they are deeply invested in the global sodomy movement, which has become not only a practice which might be tolerable, but which has become a value, so that it is no longer good to recognize the existence or the phenomenon of sodomy. You need to actually celebrate the phenomenon in the West. And so this is what we call a shaitani, or an evil force on earth. And so when they say, even with such an evil force, treaties are to be respected. With a pagan force such as the West, treaties are to be respected from a Quranic perspective. And here it says that, but treaties are not to be dissolved with those pagans, with those Westerners, with whom you have entered into alliance and who have not subsequently failed you, nor aided anyone against you. So let's say a country like Ukraine, who identifies as a Western country, who adopts the Western cultural and value system, and they do not take certain aggressive acts and make certain aggressive moves against you, then they are to be respected. Then the invasion would be illegal and illegitimate of Russia. But since Ukraine has taken an aggressive posture by declaring war on the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, by threatening to join a military alliance, and a military alliance with a record of aggression and violence, a military alliance who has invaded many countries against the United Nations Charter, which states that you can only invade when there is a United Nations Security Council resolution. The same NATO who invaded Libya without a United Nations Security Council resolution. The same NATO who invaded Serbia or Yugoslavia without a Security Council resolution. That same NATO is the NATO that now is invited by Ukraine. So Ukraine is inviting a war criminal pact, or is threatening to become part of a pact of war of criminality, NATO, the military wing of the pagan West. When NATO threatened to join NATO, when Ukraine threatened to join NATO, in fact, that is when they violated this particular verse here. the treaty then, in terms of any signatory to any international contract or agreement, became null and void when Ukraine decided to flaunt that. Because what they did was they have no aided anyone against you, so they have been aiding, the West, America and Ukraine have started aiding NATO against Russia. And they have reneged on their part of respecting the rule of law in their own country. So can you see what I mean, that, the law, legality, etc., it loses meaning when the when the opposite party no longer respects it. That's like saying, somebody's renting an apartment from you and they refuse to pay the rent, but they charge you with being cruel when you try to evict them from the apartment. When they stop paying the rent, they actually change the rules of the agreement now. And those are the thoughts I want to share with you. To recap, we have to look at the war between Russia and Ukraine as in an historical context. And I'm not going to go further back than 2014, when Ukraine violated its own constitution, when it declared war on the Donbas region and started bombing those innocent people, killing more than 3,000-4,000 people in the eastern part of Ukraine. And let me just remind you that Islam is implicated here, because the eastern part of Ukraine, do you know that the eastern part of Ukraine is the most populous part in terms of Muslim population? Did you know that? The eastern part of Ukraine has something like 15 or 10% Muslim population, many mosques, some of the greatest mosques. There's an Islamic university in the eastern part of Ukraine, and that is why you saw the Chechen brigades under Kadyrov marching into eastern Ukraine, because they feel a fraternity or brotherhood connection with the people of eastern Ukraine. But not that this is a technically Islam, non-Islam war. This is a war between righteous people who are on a position of right and the pagans. And whether it's 2022 or whether it is the year 640, as we have discussed in this series of Quranic reflections, the war between truth and evil is an eternal war. It is a war that rages in your soul, firstly. Truth and evil is a phenomenon in our very souls, but it is also a phenomenon that will play out on earth. And we are always going to be people, there's always a possibility of two evil powers fighting each other. In those wars, we don't get involved. If America and Britain should wage war against each other, or America and France, I would comfortably stand aside and let them wipe each other out, because that is the best outcome. But if a righteous power wages war against the West, and Russia is not a righteous power, but in this, I wouldn't argue that they are a righteous power as such, but their cause is just. And the attack on Ukraine has just or legitimate justification. The joining of NATO by Ukraine, the barbarity of NATO in what they've committed in Afghanistan and in Libya and in Yugoslavia, and the fact that Ukraine was ready to join NATO, the attack on the Russian-speaking population in the Donbas region, the usurping of a legitimate illegitimate usurping of power in Ukraine. They have mentioned three things that they've done. All of these three things, any one of those three would have justified an intervention there. If somebody comes to South Africa tomorrow and takes the power in Pretoria and installs a far-right government in Pretoria, I would see myself being justified in defending my country against such an imposition. Whether the CIA helps them, or whether MI6 or whether Mossad helps them, I would declare war on that illegitimate power in Pretoria. And that is exactly what has happened in Ukraine. An illegal power has taken control of the reins of government in Kiev, and it had to be ended in 2014. It festered another 8 years, and they killed so many people. Let me stop there, and those are my thoughts. Please feel free. I mean, I welcome alternative ideas or opposing ideas. What we're doing here is from the Quranic perspective, though. So if you're going to oppose, or if you're going to give an alternative idea or understanding, bring it from that perspective,